Welcome back to another episode of the Rankable podcast. I'm your host, Garrett Sussman of iPullRank, and I am stoked because we're talking about technical SEO today, and we're talking about kind of an underrated subject that gets technical in our field, which is JavaScript rendering, problems that you could run into, a very cool solution. And I have a special guest. So our main guest today is Dan Reno. Dan is a solutions consultant at Botify. So he is in the weeds when it comes to one of these really cool, interesting tools, SpeedWorkers, which we'll dive into. Self-taught technical SEO for over 15 years with a penchant for building teams. He's actually worked in a ton of agencies, so he's seen a ton of major websites. And when we're talking Botify, we're talking enterprise. So, not just your mom and pop websites. We're talking like big time, millions of pages websites. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dan.
Thanks for having me, Garrett. And Zach.
Awesome. And Zach, I can't leave out our other special guest, in-house director of SEO at iPullRank. If you want to geek out about structured data, e-commerce, technical SEO, if you want to see our ridiculous SEO battle zone series that we've been doing where Zach and Mike kind of run their mouths on all these controversial topics in SEO, we're joined today by the flying dinosaur, Zach Chahalis. Thank you for joining me, Zach.
Thank you for having me.
We've given Zach I've given Zach the nickname of the flying dinosaur, which has no sort of It came from nowhere. My brain farted.
Hey, deep down inside, I've been told I'm like 65. So I mean, I guess you're just calling me old. It's
frankly, right. It's poetic. And speaking of my poetic segue, Dan, fun fact about you. So you were a published poet at 14, and you submitted, showing all of our ages, a piece about Y2K and how it was just kind of overhyped BS. What was up with that?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely one of these. I was in private school. There was some kind of a contest going on all the schools in our network. So they're like, submit something. I being in a rather tech-centric household, and everyone was talking about Y2K. All the Armageddon movies were coming out and stuff like that. I was like, this is just ridiculous. And it was just a little piece about how it's overhyped. And apparently it was well-timed and relevant to be published. So,
dude, I mean, you get freaking Nostradamus written all over you. I remember the time. I remember like I was in high school at the time, and I remember like they were scaring us of like all the lights of the power grid was going to go off or something ridiculous. Everything was going to reset. Zach, do you remember Y2K?
Oh yeah. Maybe a tick younger, but I remember that being the whole thing of like, oh yeah, the computers and the robots are going to take over the world. And I heard more extreme versions around like, full on like Terminator style, but worked out okay, I think.
I think so too. No nuclear codes were launched or anything like that. But we are in tech. We are tech centric in this podcast. And so we're going to talk about the concept, which I think is very misunderstood in a lot of tech SEO circles, which is JavaScript rendering. Specifically, let's dive in right off the bat, Dan. Google has tried to improve JavaScript rendering, client-side rendering over the past few years. They've made strides, but from your perspective, has Google's comprehension of JavaScript actually improved?
So, I mean, the simple answer is yes, right? Especially over, let's say, let's say even the last 5 years. Okay, definitely. However, the general process hasn't really changed in that, it still has to go through what we refer to as double wave indexation, right? And this is kind of similar to how crawling of old worked, right? Where crawler crawls, finds new pages, discovers stuff, right? And then there's indexation processes that happen. Well, it's kind of an extension of the same thing, but specific to JavaScript, where, okay, they crawl in HTML first, will at this point pretty much try to execute whatever JavaScript is on there in a second pass. And then ultimately after it's done that rendering, consider it for indexation. And there's even some things in GSC that kind of like tell you like at what step of the process pages have actually gone through as well. So like, yes, they've gotten better, but there is still for most pages, it's just less efficient for them to do so.
Gotcha. To that point, Zach, are you kind of on the same page with that sort of progress?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see it getting more rendered than I saw sites getting years ago, when Google maybe went from like a pre-K reading level to like a kindergarten reading level of it. But, I still see them struggling with specifically like JavaScript frameworks that are not being, pre-rendered. They're still struggling in a lot of those instances, but it certainly has gotten better over the last couple of years.
And that kind of that leads into some of the issues that especially specifically large websites are still running into when it comes to JavaScript rendering. Dan, like what do you see? I mean, you do a lot of implementation with SpeedWorkers. Before you even get to that point when people are coming to you with problems, what are some of these major issues that people are encountering?
Yeah, so I mean, when you think about which depending on almost no matter your opinion on like crawl budget, right, as a topic, I mean, when you consider the double wave indexation process, right, if Google has to essentially crawl twice, let's say, in order to consider a page for indexation, when you have really large websites, that problem is exacerbated, right? And there's also kind of competing, let's say, solutions where like server-side rendering, is often considered to be like kind of enough. But even then, when you consider more technical concepts like hydration and stuff like that still comes into play, that again affects large sites even more because it takes Google that much more resource to get through the site, right? And so what we kind of see happening is that, it can take Google 10 days, couple weeks, maybe even an entire month to get through not even half of a website, right? Depending on just what they have going on and maybe not even sheer volume. Like it could even be like hundreds of thousands of pages as opposed to millions of pages, and Google still might not be able to get through it all if it's really dependent and heavy on JS.
Zach, are you noticing the same sort of like time delays and volume like issues?
Yeah, I am. I mean, so many larger sites, when you factor in the JavaScript rendering aspect of it and the impact on crawl budget alone, but then you factor in all the other issues that sites typically have that are impacting crawl budget and the usage of it, I feel like you're almost extending that timeline too. Like in an ideal world, if you're a large site and you didn't have other problems, yeah, I mean, a couple of weeks is pretty reasonable to see Google kind of work through all that content. When you start factoring in actual issues, directing Google to crawl dead pages or redirected pages or just things that aren't working, like then you're making that even worse. And I'm seeing that in a lot of instances now where, Google's struggling to get through all that content almost on a regular basis because they can't, the budget's just not enough. And even if you ask for that increase, you're not always guaranteed to get it.
Yeah, I mean, indexing is such a hot topic in general in terms of like even the question of whether Google's reducing indexing in general. So it's like when you add JavaScript to, the mix, you're giving yourself another opportunity to kind of shoot yourself in the foot, which kind of leads to the other side of things. Going to get into a little, I don't think it's controversial, but the whole idea of render budget, which I know, Dan, is very top of mind for you right now. To what extent is render budget a thing? What's your philosophy on Google's render budget? Like, can you explain it and talk about like how you think about it?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think Zach just kind of headed that question off very well, right? Where it's like a modifier of crawl budget, right? I mean, it's a similar kind of concept. Now, do I think that like we're going to get a metric in GSC around, rendering budget? Definitely not. I mean, I've been in this for 15 plus years and we still don't have one for crawl budget. So like that's probably never going to happen. Now, I think though, at the same time, a lot of the fundamental elements of SEO haven't really changed like a ton, which is to say that like the metrics and pieces or like insights that we can get from GSC, like, discovered, currently not indexed, crawled, currently not indexed, are a couple of really great indicators as to whether or not Google is having problems getting through, not just discovering new pages, but also rendering your pages, and whether or not that's getting in the way of indexation. So I feel like that was kind of an indirect answer, but like it's so nebulous that it's hard to really give you something more concrete, in my opinion.
To that point, and it's problematic for technical SEOs, because it's like if you have this, uncertainty, and you have, content issues where partial content's getting rendered, and I mean, we'll get into how SpeedWorker kind of solves for that. But Zach, do you have a similar like render budget philosophy?
I do, yeah, because even kind of thinking through like let's say how you're approaching a technical audit, right? Like a lot of it is evaluating, hey, why are these pages not getting indexed and crawled? And there's a whole wide variety of reasons why they might be, but it's almost another factor of like, is Google actually able to render the content that's on this page or not? So it introduces a whole different level of complexity, I think, more than like a typical like run of the mill type SEO is trying to work through. I do agree, and Google's never going to give us a number or any type of report on it. I know we talked about that at length in Battle Zone about Google's documentation. It would be nice, but I don't think I'm going to see it in my lifetime.
Well, to that point, I'm curious to both you guys, like, to what extent is it not in Google's best interest versus in their best interest to provide that metric?
Oh, this is like, this opens up a whole bunch of other controversial kind of stuff, which I don't know. It kind of comes back to something I've always said, though, right? And that like Google kind of reserves the right to do what they want and break their own rules or create exceptions. Like, the public spokespeople may say a certain position, and there's all sorts of examples of exactly the opposite all over the place, right? So it's like, in their best interest, it's even kind of hard to answer that. I mean, I think that, like, again, opinion is, I mean, we want as much knowledge as possible. Like, yes, of course, people do abuse information given and have historically, right? So I understand why they wouldn't, but I don't know, like, knowledge will set you free is kind of my general mantra. So like, I just want, as also big fan of Short Circuit and Johnny Five. So input, right? Like, that's my general MO as well. But again, those are just my wants.
Zach, are those your wants?
Yeah, I'm 100% agreement there. I mean, the first thing that came to mind when you asked that question is like PageRank and how that was abused into oblivion. Obviously it's a slightly different approach to a metric and optimizing a site for it, but I could see why Google's maybe a little close to the vest with something like that, because people are going to try and figure out ways of getting around it, or, hey, how can I tweak this so that I can get around this number, or things like that. I'm not, like, someone's going to start playing with it in a way that's going to tick off Google, like everything else that they've given us.
Yeah, it makes sense to both your points, but it's interesting nonetheless. I do want to dive into SpeedWorkers, which is fascinating. It's this dynamic rendering solution that Botify offers as part of like the activation solution, in terms of the entire suite of what Botify offers. Dan, I'd love for you to kind of just break down, like, what is SpeedWorkers? What is like a dynamic rendering solution in the first place? And like, what do you do with it?
Sure. So dynamic rendering, right? Like, and hey, speaking of Google documentation, this is actually one place that they do have some, right? Where basically you're giving the bots the optimal experience that they need, right? So pre-rendered JavaScript, like minimal execution, basically just here's a flat HTML file when bots are requesting it, right? And then users get the full rich client-side experience, right? So users are really purposely unaffected by dynamic rendering. So that said, I mean, SpeedWorkers is definitely more than just dynamic rendering, right? It's kind of dynamic rendering by SEOs for SEOs, really, right? Like because we can also do things like not just fully pre-render everything, but even go so far as to do things like taking actions, right? Which, okay, like Google has said, or there's articles out there that say Googlebot can take up to 5 clicks to try and render content, let's say, right? Well, if you've got a page that requires a lot more than 5 clicks for the full content to actually be available to search engines, well, we can also kind of assist with that, right? So making sure that all of the necessary content is rendered. But like even that aside, third-party scripts, right, are kind of historically problematic. Not that Google can't do it, but again, wouldn't it just be much better and efficient, ultimately managing the bot crawling experience to give them everything that they need on the first pass, right, as fast as possible? Ideally, within that 300 millisecond time frame that they say they prefer, they being Google. And we can also do additional things like cleaning up parameters that are unnecessary, like let's say for tracking purposes and things like that. I see Zach smiling in a big way because I know you've come across it. Totally get the idea and need to track users across the site, maybe say using query string parameters, but if they are total waste, or let's say like redirected pages, right? So again, it really is at the end of the day more than dynamic rendering, and I would say more of a bot experience manager.
Zach,
I mean, I love the idea of losing parameters, but so I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. It just kind of seems like the idea of like what was introduced with the concept of pre-rendering JavaScript-based frameworks, but just broader and kind of packaging the full thing up for search engines, regardless of the type of framework that you're on, but just kind of improving that overall experience so that they can get into it. I mean, like maybe kind of like what downsides do you see, if anything, with taking that approach?
Sure. So, I mean, we can't necessarily get to everything, right? And there is a balance with efficiency, and even like in a lot of ways, SpeedWorkers is also designed to kind of save on infrastructure cost, right? In that, like, we can kind of preempt Google's activity, and if again in the parameter example, one is the canonical version, like we're only caching that one so often, ultimately saving your costs and the load on your servers. However, right, sometimes based on what Google has been used to crawling, or just how maybe slow your origin is, right, it can be the amount of resource necessary to keep like a evergreen or up-to-date cache, right, might be kind of excessive, right? And so you have to kind of figure out that balancing act, which is pretty involved. So there's a lot of work, right? It is a pretty challenging kind of topic in general. And it is kind of a black box from Google's side as well. So yeah, I mean, I guess those are some of the drawbacks. I'm not going to say that like, there aren't, any, right? Up beyond efficiency. I mean, I would say that too, like some things that we see with other pre-rendering frameworks are like when rendering breaks, right? Like what do you do? How do you know that that's happened? Now, luckily, right, like SpeedWorkers is also robust enough to have built-in systems to be able to like not just alert you, but like actually stay on top of and know exactly where and when a rendering broke, and also not serve broken renderings to Google if that's what we encountered last time, right? So that's still more of like, the benefits and things like that. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely still additional consideration for our customers, right? Like we have to get pretty involved with their infra teams, but luckily that's usually kind of a short time period, right? Where it's almost like a project. And then, SEOs can do their thing with SpeedWorkers, and engineering teams like, okay, great. We don't have to field those tickets anymore, or, whatever the case may be. So, I hope that answers your questions. I think that.
No, it's great. I love the fact that you're also even thinking through like how to detect if the rendering failed. I mean, that's certainly something that I dealt with, I would say, in the earlier parts of, dealing with pre-rendering Angular several years ago, where, the pre-render solution that was built, if you create a new page and it wasn't incorporated into the system, it wasn't getting pre-rendered, and you don't find out until much beyond the fact where you should have. So it's great to be able to have that kind of detection in place and figure out where something's gone wrong as soon as it possibly can.
Yep.
I think it's great. I mean, to that point too, and I'd love to you to speak to the idea of, in terms of like the potential drawbacks and what hasn't been an issue, is cloaking. Because I know that Martin Splitz actually talked about dynamic rendering as like kind of Google, going back to whatever Google says, whether you can trust them or not, but they explicitly say you should do any cloaking. And yet what the solution does is not that.
Right. So, I mean, let's kind of quickly define cloaking, right? At least as far as I've understood it, you're serving different content primarily to search engines than you are users, right? At the end of the day, now typically the presumption too is that there's malicious intent, behind it in some way. However, because what we're delivering to Googlebot is, even in the case of like taking those actions, right, where there's content behind, some client-side event that needs to happen, it's still exactly what the user would experience, right? So that's really, at the end of the day, why it's certainly not cloaking. Now, that is definitely a question that we get pretty often, though, because that's to say, it's not cloaking, but then to say the way that it works is it works for bots and not users, right? Is like, kind of sounds counterintuitive. But at the same time, yes, I think this is another classic example of Google kind of sometimes talking out of both sides of their mouths, where, they also say that like they can't even ecologically keep up with rendering JavaScript at scale and things like that. But then also that like dynamic rendering is kind of a what did they recently say? Or of a stopgap or something like that, right? When again, in real terms, in practice, it doesn't seem like, yes, maybe they've gotten better, but that they can keep up with the present day JavaScript and what it does.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I mean, there's so many SEO benefits of using this tool. Can you kind of run through, like, when you're using SpeedWorkers, like why SEOs love it, like why it's appealed to them?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say, like, apart from just crawl budget benefits, which, for really large websites, our customers certainly value, not to sound like a broken record, but that full content indexation is really kind of, at the end of the day, the biggest thing, right? So, and then also, I guess like the combination of the two, where again, we're streamlining, parameters, and or even like just eliminating crawl paths that would waste crawl budget, while Google's getting all of the links and content that it needs to as soon as possible. That sort of cumulative effect, right, tends to really show a lot of benefit in, especially like non-brand keywords that, the customer is now relevant for, right? We've definitely also seen some indication that it can benefit even position, right? Because if you imagine, if there's like a PDP with, now granted, like by the time it gets to the index without dynamic rendering, reviews should already be a part of that consideration. However, if you're streamlining how you're delivering updated reviews and things like that, right? Like the freshness of the index is also that much better. And, then there can be gains that are seen from that as well. So I would say, again, it's like kind of net and cumulative effects.
Gotcha. Like, Zach, when you're working with enterprises, how do you think about like how important is it to almost like propose a solution like this if they don't have anything in place that's really considering?
I think it can be very important. I mean, that's the thing, is even within the last 48 hours, I've had various conversations with folks where it's like, a solution like this would be valuable. One where they have reviewed content that they're worried is not getting rendered for search engines, and they're trying to figure out how to solve that solution. I've dealt with too many e-commerce sites over the course of my career, and I've seen so many instances of like getting a small portion of UGC that comes in through reviews, and it's kind of disappointing with that sense. But like even in other cases as well, where we're trying to figure out, hey, how could we make a change to this page or implement this type of recommendation that we can focus on for SEO purposes, but we're running into some gaps or some issues in the implementation, or we're running into the inability for these things to get crawled and found. So I think there's tons of value. And like the more I talk to various clients and sites that I've worked with over time, like I just see a ton of value in a solution like this. Going back to the cloaking question, I still think Google's casting that net a little too wide in terms of how they're defining it. Like, it's not cloaking in this sense. And I think that's what confused a lot of folks, that I've definitely had that conversation with different people like, oh, isn't that cloaking? It's like, I can understand why you think that. No, not in the sense that Google's thinking about it. Like, they're looking at cloaking as like, you're showing something completely different. And like, I think that's an education piece that I've talked with a lot of folks over the years that I think is still coming up today.
Yeah, it almost reminds me of like the AI content conversation where it's like, you should have this blanket, all AI content's bad. It's just like, to some extent, the intent, the use case. It's like when used in a way that actually helps users like this by ultimately surfacing all the content to Googlebot, then it benefits everybody. So why would you penalize that? Anyway, exactly. I am curious, Dan, too. Actually, this was Zach's question about the near future when it comes to, do you see a day in the near future when server-side rendering wouldn't be needed?
I love this question because so do I think that server-side rendering is going to reach a point where at some level it will yield dynamic rendering somewhat moot? I think the answer is yes, but to like what extent, right? I think especially again for the enterprise level, what I'm seeing is that server-side rendering just doesn't cut it like most engineers think that it does, right? There are some frameworks out there that seem to do a pretty good job of like fully rendering everything and delivering like static HTML, even to both users and bots, right? Now, granted, this is a little bit where, my technical skills get a little bit limited as not actually being an engineer in my past or anything like that. However, as I mentioned before, there's almost always going to be things that could possibly impact search engines and the crawlability of your site, even when or server-side rendering is in place, because JavaScript is as prevalent as it is. And I think that's always going to be true, right? I think what's kind of actually a little bit, maybe not more interesting, but like almost counter to this is like what progressive web apps could mean for this whole thing, right? And like what service workers and like more edge-based kind of stuff, like, and how that works is kind of a bigger question mark for me at the end of the day. But in the near future, do I think server-side rendering, I guess like won't be needed? It is possible, yes, but I think that really it's going to end up being kind of a mix, in that like server-side rendering will only ever take you so far. I think is that's my take on it.
I got to ask your take, Zach. What do you think?
I'm actually 100% in agreement on that.
I love it. I love it when we're all on the same page. Before we move on to our rapid fire rankings, Dan, I just got to ask, is there anything about SpeedWorkers that you think we didn't cover that's really like critical that we hit on?
No, I mean, I think we definitely hit on the biggest pieces of it. And, I mean, again, it really is best for sites that are at least hundreds of thousands of pages, right? Certainly e-commerce. It's not a fit for everyone, right? I mean, even publishers, sometimes it might be a kind of a challenging, situation. It's not to say that like it won't work. It always depends, right? Had to say it at some point, but yeah, so I think we covered it pretty well at this point.
Yeah, it is an SEO podcast. It'd be ridiculous if we didn't say it depends.
I'm surprised it's that drinking word, but
I know that's a whole other different podcast series. Zach, do you have any other takes on JS rendering that you think's worth addressing?
No, I mean, I think we've covered most of it. It is an interesting topic though, because it is one that just keeps coming back up, but we still see so many people emphasizing the use of JavaScript, which certainly has plenty of use cases for, and still a good love for JavaScript-based frameworks and single-page applications. I think we've covered most of it, but I don't see the server-side rendering piece going away anytime soon. I do agree that there's that kind of case where it can, but it's still going to continue to be needed as long as folks are continuing to use JavaScript.
Yeah. I mean, regardless of how ambiguous, Google Buy is from time to time, and regardless of, kind of how much, like how big your website is or how technical it gets, this is a really important topic, because ultimately, if content can't be found, it can't be crawled, it can't be indexed, and that has a material impact on the business's visibility and search traffic. Dan, are you ready for some rapid fire rankings, sir?
Let's go.
Okay, let's put on some music and start the clock. And here we go. We're diving in. First, rank your top 3 of anything that you love. Go.
The top 3 of anything I love. This is actually now going to be tough because I have to like rank my family. Let's say my wife, my oldest son, and my youngest son. We'll just go in like kind of chronological order there. There
you go. Yeah. That's a fair caveat. We won't tell them that about this episode. Okay, rank your best SEO/marketing win.
So this is actually kind of an old one. But when I'm asked these questions, I always come back to this sort of like a test that we had done internally at Net Concepts. This was back in like probably 2009 or something like that, where we were, oddly enough, it was actually kind of a similar like circa 2008, 2009 product as what activation at Botify is kind of all about. But we were testing interlinking strategies sort of across different teams. So like people would have, a way that they were going about it. I had my way and I had the best results. And it was also a topic that I just, interlinking and site structure and that kind of stuff, like faceted navigation, is still something that I love diving into today. And that was just a ton of fun.
I love that. I swear every person that I interview brings up internal linking in some capacity. Okay, rank, and you're allowed to say Botify, but rank your top 3 SEO tools.
Yeah, I do have to put Botify as number 1, although I will qualify that, right, by saying, as I said before we started recording here, before joining Botify, I had not used Botify. Once I got in the door, or so to speak, I was like, oh, this feels like home. Like this is exactly like what I've wanted whenever I've been doing, big audits and things like that. And also like managing tech SEO ongoing. So I will put Botify at number 1. I will put SEMrush as at number 2, which was kind of a change for me over time. And then Majestic as number 3, because I have, just a deep love for Majestic and their sort of methodology.
I love it. Okay, rank your number 1 best SEO trick or tactic.
I mean, apart from just internal linking in general, right? I would say like the optimization of faceted navigation.
There you go, which is such an underrated, complicated subject. Okay, rank what you love most about SEO.
So when I was at the agency I was for the longest, we had a tagline that was like the art and science of digital marketing. And I thought that was a really good reflection of my own, interest in the industry in general. And to the point where it sounds like a lot of SEOs are also either DJs or photographers, which I think is another great example of like that creative and technical kind of balance. So yeah, I think that's really kind of the big one.
I love you. It's very much left brain, right brain. We're the same at iPullRank. It's very much kind of our philosophy. Okay, rank your number 1 best learning SEO resource.
This one is weird for me. Just having been around for so long. Like I've had people I follow, and like back in the day, it was like Alltop was like one of my favorites to just sort of scan. But like at this point, searching on Google, like I definitely, Barry Schwartz and SEO Roundtable, definitely, some of the regulars that I've always been used to. But like apart from searching in Google, I always really liked, especially the more, well, I don't know, maybe just before they got bought, but like Backlinko always produced really great content on just kind of like where we are in future casting things. And also Glenn Gabe's LinkedIn posts, I think, are awesome for technical SEOs. I think he shares just really good kind of like, here's what I'm seeing type stuff. I know others do it too. But yeah, I typically like his stuff as well.
Yeah, his analysis of algorithm updates and getting in the weeds is always so good. Okay, speaking of, rank the top 1 to 3 SEOs or marketers that you most look up to or admire.
Right, so this one I had to also choose someone I haven't worked for in the past. So first I would say like Will Reynolds has always been someone that I really looked up to since especially the first time I saw him speak. And just again, his general MO and mindset about all of this, I think is really valuable and resonates with me quite a bit. A colleague of mine for the longest time is someone by the name of Scott Waldron. I think that he is one of the best SEOs I've ever worked with. And I just, I really appreciate his perspective on everything. And then I have to say what you will, but I still do hold a special place in my heart for Gary Vee. I think that like his start in the wine world and like just the whole, evolution, I suppose, has been interesting, but I don't know. I just think that he's always said kind of what needed to be said. I don't necessarily agree with all of it all the time, but I think there's insightful things there all the time.
I hear you. You can respect the hustle. Finally, rank your number 1 cause or charity that you want to promote.
So Aspire Chicago is the one that comes to mind. And I don't know, this is a topic that I feel like there's maybe not enough organizations that approach this in like the practical way that Aspire does, where they're like really making an impact on their community. And it's kind of micro focused as opposed to like a research charity or something along those lines. And I think that's, again, resonates with my thoughts on it.
I appreciate it. And there'll be a link in the show description to support them as well. Thank you so much. This has been a really cool, interesting conversation. Dan, if people want to find you online, whether it's your go-to social media platform or just getting in touch, where's the best place to find you?
LinkedIn is the best place. Dan Reno SEO.
There you go. We'll have a link to that in the show note description as well. Thank you, Zach Chahalis, for joining us for another dynamic episode of Rankable Podcast. Thank you, Dan, for being my guest. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Garrett. And thank you, Zach. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Awesome. My name is Garrett Sussman of iPullRank. It's been another episode of the Rankable Podcast. We will catch you next week. Catch you later.